August 1941. Adolf Hitler sat in his field headquarters in East Prussia, reading an intelligence summary that made no sense. The numbers were wrong. They had to be wrong. German forces had destroyed more than 12,000 Soviet tanks in the first 8 weeks of Operation Barbarossa. 12,000. The entire pre-war estimate of Soviet tank strength had been 14,000 vehicles. By every calculation, the Red Army should be running on empty, reduced to scattered remnants, incapable of mounting any serious armored resistance. But the reports from the front told a different story. Soviet tanks kept appearing. Fresh T-34s, new KV-1s, entire formations that shouldn't exist. The Wehrmacht was still encountering organized Soviet armored units with modern equipment, fighting with a ferocity that suggested no shortage of machines or ammunition. Hitler threw the report across the table. "Where are they getting these tanks?" he demanded. "We've destroyed their factories. We've captured their industrial centers. Kharkov, Leningrad under siege. Moscow threatened. Where are these tanks coming from?" No one in the room had an answer, because no one in German intelligence had predicted what the Soviet Union had actually done. 3 months earlier, as German forces massed on the border, Soviet industrial planners had begun the largest industrial evacuation in human history. They were moving entire factories, not just equipment, but everything. The workers, their families, the machinery, the raw materials, the technical documentation. They were relocating the Soviet Union's industrial heart eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers, beyond the advance of German tanks. And they were doing it in secret. The operation had begun in July 1941, within days of the German invasion. Trains rolled eastward, carrying dismantled factory equipment through the night. Entire production lines were packed into railway cars. Blast furnaces were disassembled piece by piece. Machine tools were wrapped and loaded. Technical specialists rode in the same cars as their equipment, sleeping on the floors, eating whatever food could be found at stations along the route. Lydia Mikhailovna worked at the Kirov tank plant in Leningrad. She was 23 years old, a lathe operator who had learned her trade in the factory's technical school. On July 29th, a supervisor found her at her station. "Pack your tools," he said. "We're leaving." "Leaving?" she asked. "Where?" "East. That's all I know. Pack everything you need. We leave tonight." By midnight, Lydia stood on a railway platform with 200 other workers, watching as cranes loaded their factory onto flat cars. The machinery she'd operated for 3 years was being taken apart, each component numbered, each bolt accounted for. Technical drawings were packed in waterproof cases. Even the smallest tools were catalogued and loaded. The train left Leningrad at 2 in the morning, running without lights, moving slowly eastward on tracks congested with military traffic moving west. Lydia sat in a freight car with 19 other women, their backs against crates of precision instruments, trying to sleep as the train swayed and rattled through the darkness. They traveled for 11 days. The train stopped at small stations where local officials had been ordered to provide food and water. Sometimes they stopped for hours, waiting as military trains passed. Sometimes they stopped because the tracks ahead were damaged by German bombing. They kept moving east. On the 9th day, someone asked where they were going. The supervisor, a man named Petrov who had worked at the Kirov plant for 18 years, finally told them, "Chelyabinsk, in the Urals. We're going to rebuild the factory there." "Rebuild?" Lydia asked. "How long will that take?" Petrov looked at her with exhausted eyes. "We have to be producing tanks by October. 2 months." The train arrived in Chelyabinsk on August 9th. The city sat on the eastern slopes of the Ural Mountains, 1,500 kilometers from the front, far beyond the range of German aircraft. It was home to a tractor factory, a sprawling industrial complex that had produced agricultural equipment since the 1930s. The tractor factory was about to become something else entirely. Lydia stepped off the train into a landscape transformed into an enormous construction site. Thousands of workers were building new factory halls. Concrete was being poured 24 hours a day. Steel frames rose from the ground, taking shape even as equipment from evacuated plants arrived and was installed in buildings that weren't yet finished. The Kharkov plant equipment was unloaded directly onto foundation slabs. Workers assembled machinery in the open air, building walls around it as they worked. Lydia found her lathe being installed in a building with no roof, walls rising around it even as she reconnected the power supply and tested the controls. It rained on September 3rd. Lydia worked in the downpour, water running down her face, hands numb from cold, installing the final components of her machine. Above her, construction workers hammered sheet metal into place, creating a roof one section at a time. By September 15th, parts of the factory were producing tank components, not complete tanks yet, but parts. Turret rings, transmission housings, track links, the pieces of a T-34 made on machines that had been in Leningrad a month earlier. The factory ran day and night. Workers slept in barracks built from green lumber, walls so thin that frost formed on the inside during cold nights. Food was rationed. Bread, thin soup, sometimes a bit of meat. Everyone was hungry, everyone was exhausted, and everyone kept working, because the front was getting closer. By October, German forces were approaching Moscow. The Soviet government was evacuating. For a few desperate weeks, it seemed possible that the Soviet Union might collapse entirely, that the German advance would never stop, that everything would be lost. In Chelyabinsk, they worked faster. The factory that was emerging from the construction site was unlike anything that had existed before. It wasn't just the Kharkov plant anymore. Equipment from the Kharkov diesel factory had arrived. Machinery from smaller plants in occupied territories. The facility was becoming a hybrid, combining the production capacity of multiple factories into a single, massive complex. Someone started calling it Tankograd, Tank City. The name stuck. By November, Tankograd produced its first complete T-34. Lydia was there when the tank rolled off the assembly line, its engine running, fresh paint still wet. Workers cheered, some cried. The tank drove directly from the factory floor to a railway loading dock, where it was shipped west to the front. The next day they produced 2 tanks, then 3, then 5. In East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was receiving new intelligence reports, and the numbers made even less sense than before. Soviet tank production wasn't collapsing. It was increasing. Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, presented the latest estimates at a military conference in November 1941. Our intelligence now indicates Soviet tank production may exceed 700 vehicles per month, he said. Hitler stared at him. 700? That's impossible. We've destroyed their industrial base. Apparently not, my Führer. The Soviets appear to have relocated substantial industrial capacity eastward, beyond the Urals. Our aircraft cannot reach these facilities. Cannot reach them? Hitler's voice rose. You're telling me the Russians have built new tank factories and we don't know where they are? Not built, my Führer. Relocated. They moved their factories. Entire production complexes were dismantled and transported east by rail. They're producing tanks in locations we didn't know existed. Hitler stood, pacing the room. How many factories? We don't know exactly. Signals intelligence suggests at least 400 major industrial facilities have been relocated. Possibly more. 400. Hitler turned to face Halder. 400 factories and our intelligence services knew nothing about this? The room was silent. Hitler's face had gone red, his hands trembling with rage. You told me, he said, his voice low and dangerous, that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. You told me their industrial capacity was destroyed. You told me they couldn't replace their losses, and now you're telling me they've moved 400 factories across the Urals and are producing more tanks than ever. The relocation operation was unprecedented in scale. Halder said carefully. No intelligence service could have predicted. Don't tell me what could be predicted, Hitler shouted. I started this war based on your estimates, based on your assurances that Soviet industrial capacity was limited, that they couldn't sustain a long campaign, that their production would collapse once we captured their western territories. He grabbed an intelligence report from the table and threw it. Papers scattered across the room. If I had known the Russians could do this, Hitler said, his voice shaking, if I had known they could move their entire industrial base beyond our reach, I might never have started this war. The words hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood what Hitler had just admitted. The fundamental assumption underlying Operation Barbarossa, the belief that the Soviet Union could be defeated in a single campaign before its industrial potential could be mobilized, was wrong. The Soviets had mobilized their industry. They had done it while under attack, while losing millions of soldiers, while German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers into their territory. And they had done it so effectively that German intelligence hadn't even realized it was happening until it was too late to stop. In Tankograd, production accelerated through the winter. By December 1941, the facility was producing 20 tanks per day. By January 1942, 30 per day. Workers lived in the factory, sleeping in corners of the production halls, working 16-hour shifts, surviving on bread and soup and the knowledge that every tank they built might save Soviet lives at the front. Lydia Mikhailovna worked her lathe until her hands bled, until she could barely stand, until supervisors ordered her to rest. She would sleep for 4 hours, wake up, and return to her machine. Around her, thousands of others did the same. The factory operated in conditions that would have shut down any Western industrial facility. Winter temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Parts of the factory still had no walls, just tarps stretched over frames. Workers wore every piece of clothing they owned. Gloves cut away at the fingertips so they could operate precision machinery. Frostbite was common. Exhaustion was universal. But the tanks kept coming. By spring 1942, Tankograd alone was producing more tanks than the entire German armaments industry. The facility had become the largest tank production center in the world, a sprawling complex employing 50,000 workers, running 24 hours a day, producing T-34s at a rate German intelligence had declared impossible. And Tankograd wasn't alone. Other evacuated factories had begun production. Nizhny Tagil, where the Dzerzhinsky-Ural railway car factory had merged with evacuated plants to produce T-34s. Sverdlovsk, where artillery factories had been relocated, Omsk, Novosibirsk, dozens of other cities across the Urals and Siberia, all producing weapons beyond the reach of German bombers. The Soviet Union had created a hidden industrial empire. An empire built in months under conditions of total war by workers who understood that failure meant defeat and likely death. In June 1942, Hitler received an updated intelligence estimate. Soviet tank production was now estimated at 1,000 vehicles per month, possibly more. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, was present when Hitler read the report. He later wrote about Hitler's reaction. The Führer sat in silence for several minutes, Speer recalled. Then he said, very quietly, "They're building tanks underground, and we're fighting them with our hands tied behind our backs." Underground. The word captured Hitler's incomprehension. To German military planners, the idea that an industrial base could be relocated, rebuilt, and expanded while under attack was almost inconceivable. It violated every assumption about modern warfare. It suggested a level of economic mobilization and social control that Germany, for all its totalitarian apparatus, had not achieved. The Soviet factories weren't literally underground, but they might as well have been. They were invisible to German intelligence, unreachable by German aircraft, operating at a scale that seemed to defy physical possibility. Hitler's statement about fighting with hands tied behind our backs referred to Germany's own industrial limitations. Despite controlling most of Europe, despite having access to resources from France to the Black Sea, Germany was producing fewer tanks than the Soviet Union. German factories were still operating on single shifts. Consumer goods production continued. The German economy hadn't fully mobilized for total war. Hitler had believed the war would be won quickly, that full mobilization wouldn't be necessary. Now, facing an enemy that had mobilized completely, that had sacrificed everything for the weapons production, he was discovering the cost of that miscalculation. In August 1942, Hitler ordered a complete reorganization of German war production. Speer was given unprecedented authority to increase output. Consumer goods production was cut. Factories converted to military production. Workers were transferred from non-essential industries. Germany was finally mobilizing for total war. But the Soviets had a 2-year head start. By the end of 1942, Soviet industry had produced 24,000 tanks. Germany produced 9,000. The gap would only widen. Lydia Mikhailovna never saw the front. She spent the entire war in Tankograd, operating her lathe, producing components for T-34s that would fight at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Berlin. She worked until May 1945, until the day news arrived that Germany had surrendered. When the war ended, Lydia had been operating the same lathe for nearly 4 years. She had produced components for an estimated 3,000 tanks. Her hands were scarred from years of metalwork. Her hearing was damaged from the constant noise of the factory floor. She had lost 20 kilograms from wartime rations. She had survived. After the war, Soviet officials calculated the full scale of the industrial evacuation. 1,523 enterprises had been relocated. 10 million people had moved east. The operation had transported 2 million railway cars of equipment and supplies. It was the largest and most successful industrial relocation in history, and it had saved the Soviet Union. Without the evacuated factories, without Tankograd and the other relocated facilities, the Soviet Union could not have replaced its catastrophic tank losses in 1941 and 42. The Red Army would have run out of equipment. The front would have collapsed. Moscow might have fallen. The war might have been lost. Instead, Soviet industry produced more tanks than Germany throughout the war. By 1945, the Soviet Union had manufactured over 100,000 armored vehicles. Germany produced 46,000. The industrial war was decided in the summer and fall of 1941, when Soviet planners made the desperate decision to abandon their Western factories and rebuild in the East. It was decided by workers like Lydia, who assembled machinery in the rain, who operated lathes in unheated buildings, who worked until they collapsed and then worked more. Hitler had been right about one thing. If he had known what the Soviet Union was capable of, if he had understood that an industrial base could be relocated and expanded under conditions of total war, if he had grasped the level of sacrifice Soviet workers would endure, he might have made different decisions. But by the time German intelligence understood what had happened, by the time Hitler realized the Soviets were producing tanks in hidden factories beyond the reach of German power, it was too late. The industrial war was already lost. In November 1942, Hitler held a conference with his military leadership. The topic was Soviet industrial capacity. New intelligence estimates suggested Soviet tank production might reach 1,500 vehicles per month by 1943. German production was struggling to reach half that number. Hitler listened to the reports in silence. Then he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are not fighting the Soviet Union we thought we were fighting. We are fighting an enemy that can move mountains, an enemy that can build factories from nothing, an enemy that produces tanks like we produce excuses." He paused, looking around the room. "And we are losing." It was one of the few times during the war that Hitler publicly acknowledged the possibility of defeat. The admission came because he had finally understood what Soviet industrial mobilization meant. The hidden factories, the relocated production, the tanks appearing from nowhere, they weren't anomalies. They were the result of a system that had mobilized completely, that had subordinated everything to survival and victory. Germany had started the war believing in the superiority of its military organization, its tactical doctrine, its technological edge. But wars are not won by tactical superiority alone. They are won by production capacity, by industrial endurance, by the ability to replace losses and sustain operations over years. The Soviet Union had that capacity. Germany did not. By 1943, the strategic situation was clear. Soviet industry was outproducing German industry across every category of military equipment. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, ammunition, all were being manufactured at rates Germany couldn't match. The hidden factories, the relocated production centers, the industrial complexes built in the Urals and Siberia, they were producing the weapons that would eventually destroy the Wehrmacht. Hitler's statement about underground production wasn't literally accurate, but it captured a deeper truth. The Soviet industrial system had become invisible to German intelligence, unreachable by German military power, and unstoppable by any means Germany possessed. The factories weren't underground. They were simply beyond Germany's ability to affect them, and that made all the difference. In Tankograd, production continued until the end of the war. The facility produced over 18,000 tanks and self-propelled guns between 1941 and 1945. It employed 70,000 workers at peak production. It operated continuously without a single day of shutdown for the entire duration of the war. After the war, Tankograd continued operating. The facility that had been built in desperate circumstances, assembled from evacuated equipment, staffed by workers who had survived on bread and soup, became a permanent industrial center. It produced tanks throughout the Cold War. Some of its production lines operated until the 1990s. The legacy of the Soviet industrial evacuation extended far beyond the war itself. It demonstrated that industrial capacity could be relocated and rebuilt under extreme conditions. It showed that production could be maintained even while under attack. It proved that human endurance and organizational capability could overcome what seemed like impossible circumstances. For Hitler, the discovery of Soviet hidden production capacity came too late. By the time German intelligence understood the scale of the evacuation, by the time Hitler realized the Soviets were producing tanks at rates that exceeded German capacity, the strategic initiative had already shifted. The industrial war was decided. Everything that followed was consequence. The tanks that rolled out of Tankograd and other relocated facilities didn't just replace Soviet losses. They created a quantitative advantage that eventually became overwhelming. By 1944, Soviet armored forces outnumbered German forces by ratios of 3-to-1, 4-to-1, sometimes higher. That numerical superiority, combined with improving Soviet tactical doctrine and growing German resource shortages, created the conditions for Soviet victory. Hitler had started Operation Barbarossa, believing the Soviet Union was industrially weak, that its production capacity could be destroyed by capturing its western territories, that it couldn't sustain a long war. Every one of those assumptions proved wrong. The Soviet Union was industrially powerful enough to relocate its entire production base. Its capacity couldn't be destroyed because it was mobile, and it could sustain a long war because it had mobilized completely, sacrificing everything for military production. When Hitler learned the truth, when he finally understood that the Soviets were producing tanks in hidden factories beyond his reach, his reaction mixed rage, incomprehension, and something close to despair. He had started a war based on false assumptions, and by the time he learned the truth, it was too late to change course. The industrial war was over. Germany had lost. Everything else was just the working out of consequences that had already been determined in the factories of the Urals, in facilities built by workers like Lydia Mikhailovna, in the hidden industrial empire that Soviet planners had created while Hitler's armies advanced. The tanks kept coming, and they never